When you truly defeat a narcissist, the breakthrough does not come through some huge, explosive argument, a dramatic movie-like showdown, or a satisfying moment where they finally admit they were wrong. The ultimate sign of your victory is something much more shocking, and it is the complete opposite of what most survivors expect. It is absolute silence, total silence. For anyone who has spent months or even years trapped inside the exhausting cycle of narcissistic abuse, this sudden disappearance of all the noise can feel strange, uncomfortable, and even frightening. You become so used to the constant conflict, the endless messages, the emotional games, and the predictable highs and lows that when everything suddenly becomes still, your mind almost does not know what to do with it. You keep waiting for the next message, the next accusation, the next emotional explosion, but nothing comes. And that is exactly what makes this moment so powerful. This is not simply a pause in the chaos. It can represent the moment when the old pattern finally stops working. The moment when they realize that the person they used to control is no longer responding the same way. And once you understand what this silence really means, you will never look at it the same way again. To understand the power of this silence, you first have to understand what it is not, because silence itself can be used as a weapon. The silent treatment you experienced during the relationship was not peaceful at all. It was designed to punish you, confuse you, and push you into chasing after their approval. It was meant to make you question yourself and eventually become desperate for a response. This is completely different. This is not cold shoulder ghosting meant to activate your fear of abandonment. It is not a planned disappearance designed to make you panic and send another message. It is not even the temporary silence that sometimes happens after a discard while they focus their attention somewhere else. Those forms of silence still depend on one thing, your reaction. They expect you to break. They expect you to reach out. They expect you to wonder what you did wrong and eventually return to restore the connection. But when you stop responding emotionally, that entire system begins to lose its power. The silence becomes different. It becomes heavy, still, almost strangely empty. Not because you are waiting for them to come back, but because you are no longer waiting for anything at all. And stay with this, because this is where the real shift begins. Think about how the pattern usually works when you try to walk away, establish a firm boundary, or finally confront behavior that you can no longer accept. A person who is deeply invested in maintaining control may not simply accept the change and disappear. Instead, they may try different ways to pull you back into the old emotional cycle. First can come the desperate attempts to reconnect. Suddenly they become softer, kinder, more apologetic. They may say exactly the things you spent years hoping to hear. They may promise to change, promise to get help, bring up old memories, or remind you of the good moments you shared. It can feel like the person you always wanted has suddenly returned. But then, if those tactics stop working, the emotional tone can change very quickly. Anger appears, accusations begin, insults may follow. They may try to intimidate you or make you feel guilty for standing your ground. And if that still fails, they may attempt to influence how other people see you. Friends, relatives, co-workers, or mutual connections can suddenly hear a completely different version of the story. The goal is often to create confusion and pressure you into defending yourself. But here is the part most people miss. As long as you keep reacting, the cycle still has fuel. An unhealthy power struggle can continue for a very long time because both sides remain emotionally connected to the conflict. Even a terrible argument can create a sense of connection. Even anger can become a form of access. If they can make you furious, they know they can still reach you. If they can make you explain yourself for hours, they know they can still pull your attention toward them. If they can make you check your phone repeatedly, wonder what they are doing, or spend your night trying to understand their behavior, they still occupy valuable space inside your mind. That is why your real breakthrough does not happen when you finally win an argument. It happens when you no longer need to win one. You stop explaining. You stop defending every detail. You stop trying to make them understand your pain. You stop waiting for the apology that may never come. And most importantly, you stop measuring your healing by their reaction. That is the psychological turning point. The person who once had the power to change your entire emotional state suddenly cannot do it anymore. And once that happens, something remarkable begins to happen inside you. The moment you develop genuine mental freedom, the entire dynamic can change. You begin seeing the pattern instead of getting lost inside it. You recognize the bait before you take it. You hear the familiar words without automatically believing them. You notice the emotional pressure without immediately obeying it. You understand that not every accusation requires a response and not every message deserves your attention. This is where the old playbook starts becoming useless. The drama loses its purpose because you are no longer participating in it. The emotional machine begins to slow down. Then sometimes it stops completely. No desperate late-night messages, no sudden emotional explosions, no endless accusations, no carefully arranged encounters, no new attempts to pull you into another exhausting conversation. Just nothing. Silence. And that silence can feel louder than every argument that came before it. Why? Because for the first time, the absence of their behavior gives you something you could never receive while you were constantly reacting. Space, a real space. Space to hear your own thoughts again. Space to remember who you were before the chaos. Space to discover that peace does not need their permission. This is also why the silence can feel so uncomfortable at first. Your nervous system has been trained to expect disruption. You may find yourself checking your phone even when there is no reason to. You may wonder whether the silence is temporary. You may start thinking, what are they planning? You may even miss the intensity simply because intensity became familiar. That does not mean you want the relationship back. It means your mind is adjusting to a completely different environment. When someone has lived through repeated emotional highs and lows, peace can initially feel suspicious. Calm can feel like the calm before another storm, but eventually you begin to recognize the difference. This is not the silence you once feared. It is the silence you once needed. There is no longer a constant demand for your attention. No emotional emergency requiring immediate action. No need to prove your worth. No need to convince someone to treat you with basic respect. The silence becomes evidence that your attention has returned to you. And once your attention returns to you, their influence begins to shrink. The biggest mistake you can make at this stage is assuming that their silence means you should break yours. Do not turn their quiet into another reason to monitor them. Do not start checking their social media every few minutes. Do not ask mutual friends what they are doing. Do not create a reason to contact them simply because the absence feels strange. Remember what the old cycle depended on, your emotional involvement. If you keep looking for signs, you may accidentally rebuild the connection inside your own mind, even when there is no real connection happening in your life anymore. Your freedom is not proven by whether they miss you. It is proven by whether you can live without needing to know. That is a much deeper victory. You no longer need to know what they are thinking. You no longer need to know whether they regret losing you. You no longer need to know whether they found someone else. You do not need their reaction to validate your decision. You simply know that your life is moving forward, and that realization is far more powerful than any dramatic confrontation could ever be. There is another important layer to this transformation. When you stop responding, you stop giving the other person a map of your emotional weaknesses. They can no longer easily see what makes you angry, what makes you anxious, what makes you feel guilty, or what makes you desperate for reassurance. Your reactions are no longer available as easy information. The buttons they once knew how to push stop producing the same result. This does not mean you become cold or emotionless. It means you become intentional. You still feel things. You simply stop handing every feeling to someone else to manage. That distinction is enormous. Healing does not mean becoming someone who never gets triggered. Healing means you can notice the trigger without allowing it to control your next decision. You can feel anger without sending the message. You can feel sadness without returning to the source of the pain. You can remember the good moments without rewriting the bad ones. And you can miss someone without deciding that missing them means you should go back. That is emotional independence. That is the kind of freedom nobody else can give you. And now comes the part that surprises many survivors. The final victory may not look like victory at all. There may be no audience, no confession, no apology, no dramatic ending where everything suddenly makes sense. There may simply be an ordinary morning when you realize you have not checked your phone to see whether they contacted you. You go through your day without wondering what they are doing. You laugh without thinking about whether they would approve. You make plans without imagining how they might react. You begin enjoying your own life again. Then one day you notice something even bigger. Their silence no longer feels like a threat. It feels normal. That is when you know the center of gravity is shifted. The person who once seemed capable of controlling the emotional weather of your entire life is no longer controlling the forecast. You are no longer standing at the window waiting for the storm. You have walked outside. You have built a different life, and the storm can exist somewhere else without becoming your world. So if you are currently experiencing this strange quiet, do not rush to fill it. Let the silence exist. Let it teach you something. You do not have to interpret every pause. You do not have to search for hidden messages. You do not have to prove that you won. In fact, the less you need to prove, the stronger your position becomes. Your real breakthrough is not making another person suffer. It is reaching the point where their behavior no longer determines your emotional direction. That is the difference between revenge and freedom. Revenge still keeps you connected. Freedom releases you. Revenge asks, do they realize what they lost? Freedom says, it does not matter anymore. Revenge waits for their reaction. Freedom stops watching. And that is why absolute silence can become such a powerful symbol of closure. Not because silence magically defeats another person, but because your life no longer revolves around getting a response from them. The game ends when you stop playing. There may still be difficult days. You may have moments when old memories return. You may feel anger about everything you tolerated. You may wonder why you stayed so long. Be gentle with yourself during those moments. Do not use your past confusion as evidence that you are weak. You are responding to a situation that was emotionally exhausting, and now you are learning a different way to live. The goal is not to erase your history. The goal is to stop letting your history dictate your future. Every time you choose peace instead of another argument, you strengthen that new direction. Every time you refuse to explain yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you, you strengthen it. Every time you turn your attention back toward your own goals, relationships, health, work, creativity, and future, you strengthen it again. Little by little, the person who once consumed your thoughts becomes a smaller and smaller part of your story, until eventually they are simply a chapter, not the whole book. And if you remember only one thing from this entire message, remember this: you do not need a final conversation to be free. You do not need them to confess. You do not need them to understand your pain. You do not need them to admit that they were wrong. Sometimes closure is not something another person gives you. Sometimes closure begins when you stop asking them for it. The silence becomes powerful because you finally understand that nothing else needs to happen. No more explanations, no more emotional negotiations, no more proving, no more waiting for someone to become the person you hoped they would be. Your energy belongs to you again. Your attention belongs to you again. Your future belongs to you again. And when that happens, the silence is no longer empty. It is peaceful, it is protective. It is the sound of a cycle losing its grip. So let it stay quiet. Let the old drama disappear into the distance. Keep moving forward. Because the most powerful ending is not when they finally admit defeat. It is when you realize you no longer care whether they do. It has been completely sealed shut, and for the first time in their life, they are standing in front of a wall they cannot climb, break, or find a way around. For a survivor who has been trained for months or even years to expect constant emergencies, mind games, and repeated emotional chaos, this sudden and eerie quiet can feel deeply confusing at first. Instead of experiencing instant relief, you may remain stuck in a state of high alert, constantly waiting for something bad to happen. You wake up expecting another wave of drama. You check your phone again and again. You prepare yourself for a cruel message, a hostile email, or another attempt to damage your reputation. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you are already preparing your defense, for the next attack you assume is coming. But then nothing happens. The attack never arrives. 1 week passes, then another. Weeks become months, and the silence continues to stretch across the distance. This is where something important begins to happen. The chaos you once considered normal is no longer controlling your daily life. And if you want to understand why this silence can last, you need to understand the pattern behind it. People with strong narcissistic traits often focus their effort where they believe there is still an opening they can use. They look for traces of guilt, hope, fear, self-doubt, or emotional attachment that can become a path back into your thoughts. They may test your boundaries to see whether there is still a weak point. The important thing is not to think of this as some mysterious law that applies to every narcissistic person, but as a common pattern in unhealthy relationships. Manipulation tends to continue when it receives a reaction. Anger, pressure, guilt, and confusion can all become tools when someone knows those things will pull you back into the conversation. Think of it like someone repeatedly testing a locked door. They push, they knock, they try different handles. But eventually they realize the door is not opening. And when every attempt produces the same result, the motivation to keep trying can disappear. This is why your emotional response matters so much. The moment you stop entering every argument, stop explaining every accusation, and stop defending yourself against every distortion, the old cycle begins losing its fuel. When they create anger and chaos, they may expect you to question yourself, feel guilty, or become desperate to prove your side of the story. They may provoke you because they know that once you become emotionally overwhelmed, you are more likely to engage. And the moment you step back into that emotional ring, the connection remains alive. You may think you are defending yourself, but from the outside, they simply see that they can still reach you. That is why one of the strongest changes you can make is refusing to give every provocation a response. You do not have to become cruel. You do not have to become emotionless. You simply stop handing your emotional steering wheel to someone else. When your boundaries become firm and your reactions become controlled, the entire dynamic can change. You are no longer providing affection simply because they demand it. You are also refusing to provide endless anger, fear, or emotional reactions. There is less for the conflict to feed on. The old pattern becomes harder to maintain. And this is the part you need to remember, because your silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is what finally exposes how little power the old tactics actually had. Eventually, continuing to spend energy on someone who no longer responds can become pointless. The arguments stop producing anything. The guilt stops working. The emotional pressure gets no reward. The attempts to provoke you create no visible reaction. So the attention moves somewhere else. This does not mean every person with narcissistic traits will respond in exactly the same way. And it does not mean silence always proves defeat. Human behavior is more complicated than that. But when someone has repeatedly depended on emotional reactions to maintain a toxic connection, your consistent refusal to participate can completely change the relationship dynamic. The silence that follows is not necessarily a grand act of respect for your boundaries. It may simply be the result of realizing that the old methods are no longer producing the desired response. That distinction matters. Do not wait for their silence to become an apology. Do not turn their disappearance into another reason to monitor them. Your freedom comes from what you do with the space they leave behind. And this is where the real victory begins. You also have to understand how difficult it can be for a person who is deeply invested in control to accept repeated rejection. If their identity depends heavily on feeling superior, admired, desired, or powerful, losing access to someone can feel like a serious threat to that self-image. Instead of openly admitting, "I lost control here," they may create another explanation that protects their ego. They may tell themselves they were never interested. They may claim they walked away by choice. They may act as though you were never important. They may tell other people that they simply became bored or moved on. This is not necessarily an accurate reflection of what happened. It can simply be a way of protecting their preferred version of reality, and this is something survivors often struggle with. You may want them to admit the truth. You may want them to acknowledge what they did. You may want them to say, "You were right." But healing does not require that confession. In fact, waiting for it can keep you emotionally attached to the very person you are trying to leave behind. That is why the sudden wall of silence can become so powerful. When the old connection disappears, you are no longer constantly receiving information about what they think, what they feel, or what they are planning. You stop seeing their name appear on your screen. You stop hearing about them through mutual contacts. You stop noticing suspicious activity around your social media. You stop running into them in places where you once expected to see them. And when those things disappear, the mind may initially become even more alert because it has been trained to search for danger. You might wonder, are they planning something? Why have they stopped? Does this mean they are coming back later? Those questions are understandable, but do not allow uncertainty to become another chain. You do not need to solve the mystery. You need to notice what the silence gives you. It gives you distance, it gives you time, it gives your mind a chance to stop reacting. Most importantly, it gives you the opportunity to build a life that does not depend on anticipating another person's next move. Sometimes the person who has been trying to maintain control will also want other people to believe that everything is perfectly fine. They may present themselves as completely unaffected. They may act as though they moved on without any difficulty. They may create a public story that makes them look like the person who chose to leave. Again, you do not need to challenge that story. You do not need to convince everyone of what really happened. You do not need to run around collecting evidence simply to prove that your experience was real. Your healing does not require a courtroom. Let people believe whatever they choose to believe. What matters is that you know what you experienced and that you are now choosing a different life. Their version of events does not have the power to rewrite your reality. And if they need to create a story that protects their image, let them have it. You do not need to enter the story. You are writing a completely different chapter now. Keep listening, because the next part is where many survivors finally understand why leaving changes more than just the relationship. If you have built boundaries that are strong enough to create this kind of distance, do not immediately question yourself just because the other person has gone quiet. You may be so accustomed to constant pressure that silence feels suspicious. You may wonder whether you were too harsh. You may feel guilty because there is no longer a conflict demanding your attention. But boundaries are not cruelty. Distance is not revenge. Choosing not to participate in repeated emotional chaos is not a moral failure. You are allowed to protect your peace. You are allowed to stop answering conversations that only lead back to the same cycle. You are allowed to decide that an explanation is no longer worth another argument, and you are allowed to move forward without receiving permission from the person who hurt you. The strongest sign of progress may not be that they disappear. It may be that you stop needing to know why they disappeared. That is a huge difference. One keeps your attention on them. The other brings your attention home. But the story does not necessarily end with the silent retreat. The bigger change happens inside your own life after the chaos has been removed. Many people assume that when a toxic person leaves, they simply move on to someone else and continue exactly as before. Sometimes that may happen. But you should not build your healing around predicting what happens to them next. Your focus needs to be on what happens when you are no longer part of the equation. When you remove yourself from a chaotic relationship, you are not simply removing attention or validation. You are removing your participation from a system that may have consumed enormous amounts of emotional energy. For months or years, you may have spent your time calming arguments, repairing conflicts, explaining yourself, offering reassurance, forgiving repeated behavior, and trying to keep the relationship stable. That effort can become invisible because you were doing it every day. But it was still effort. It was still energy. And when you finally stop supplying it, you may discover just how much of your life was being spent managing someone else's instability. People with empathy, patience, integrity, and emotional strength can sometimes become deeply involved in trying to stabilize an unhealthy relationship. They keep believing that if they communicate better, love harder, forgive more, or explain themselves more clearly, the situation will finally improve. They become the person who absorbs the tension. They become the person who apologizes first. They become the person who keeps the peace. Over time, they can accidentally become part of the structure holding the entire dysfunctional pattern together. Remove yourself, and that structure changes. Suddenly, there is no one constantly smoothing everything over, no one rushing in to repair every emotional explosion, no one endlessly accepting responsibility for problems they did not create, no one standing there to absorb the impact. And that is why leaving can create such a dramatic shift. You are not responsible for what happens inside another person's mind after you leave. You are responsible for what happens inside your own life once you are finally free to live it differently. For a long time, you may have believed that your greatest power was your ability to love, forgive, explain, understand, and remain patient. Those qualities can be beautiful, but without boundaries, they can also be exploited. Real strength is not endlessly tolerating behavior that destroys your peace. Real strength is knowing when compassion needs a boundary. It is understanding that you can care about someone and still refuse to participate in their chaos. You can remember the good moments and still accept that the relationship was unhealthy. You can wish someone well from a distance without opening the door again. And you can stop carrying the responsibility for fixing someone who never took responsibility for fixing themselves. That is the shift that changes everything. You stop trying to rescue the relationship and start protecting your life. You stop asking, how can I make this work? And begin asking, what kind of life do I want to build now? Stay with that question, because once you start asking it honestly, the silence stops being frightening. It starts becoming freedom.